This is Dr. Ted Hildebrandt in his New Testament History, Literature, and Theology course, Lecture number 17, on the Introduction to John, on belief, sign miracles, particularly the wedding feast at Canaan, Jesus making water into wine, and also that Jesus is God in the book of John. Well, good afternoon. This is the Saturday before Easter, and we're talking about the book of John. And in our last session, we were going over the person of John, or the author, or the perspective of the book. And we tried to show that the book of John is very Hebrew, a very Jewish-oriented book. It picks up feasts that nobody else lists. Even has the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights or Dedication, listed in the book of John that nobody else picks up. He mentions he's very topographically aware of what's going on. He mentions Bethany on the other side of Jordan and other types of things that you would expect an eyewitness to pick up. For example, he lists this was done in the 6th hour, this was done in the 9th hour, and he lists exact hours when things, which is a mark of an eyewitness. And also somebody that's Palestinian, that's Jewish, and we've been going through various things and showing his special closeness of Christ. We talked about the disciple, him taking the moniker that Jesus Christ, he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that moniker then is his way of portraying himself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is a special title. We also noticed that the disciple whom Jesus loved has a close association with Peter. And Peter and the disciple went fishing. We said in chapter 20 there was a foot race, and Peter was outrun by the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so this disciple was close to Peter and fishing in Galilee and those types of things. Special intimacy with Christ. At the Last Supper we were talking about, he seems to be sitting closer to Jesus than Peter. And Peter, who's never really bashful, asks this disciple, which one is going to betray us and stuff. Ask Jesus what it is. So Peter goes through this other disciple whom Jesus loved as an intermediary. And so he said this disciple, and we noticed that Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, were always, in many, many contexts, at Gethsemane, at the raising of the dead girl, at the transfiguration, Peter, James, and John were like the inner three circle. And so, and also this disciple whom Jesus loved, on the cross, Jesus looks at his mother and says to this disciple, this is your son, this is your mother. And this disciple then took care of Jesus' mother. So Jesus had to have really trusted this fellow to take care of his mother. And so actually with the foot race too, I'd say the guy is probably younger, because you're going to ask somebody to take care of your mother. You want somebody younger, not somebody older. And so that would be another argument I would think against somebody like Lazarus or something like that. Peter and John had close associations. We noticed that, Transfiguration, Garden of Gethsemane, and the healing. Later in the book of Acts, too, when they heal the cripple in Acts chapter 3, it was Peter and John together. Silver or gold have I none, kind of thing in Acts chapter 3, verse 1 and following. They're before the Sanhedrin in chapter 4:19. So even the book of Acts picks up. Peter and John are tight and they're together, even after all this. So when Paul refers to the disciples in Galatians chapter 2, he says Peter, James, and John were the three pillars. So when Paul picks the big honchos in the early church, it's Peter, James, and John. And so we would expect, John to write a gospel, and Jesus certainly qualified to do that. James is out of the picture early, because James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, James is killed very early in the church, and so James is out of the way immediately. The writer of the book of James is probably the brother of Jesus, not the James, the son of Zebedee, that's John's brother. The other way you can work this too, and let me just do one other thing before we do the elimination procedure, and that is whoever wrote this book seems to know the inside of the thinking of the disciples. So in chapter 2, John 2:22, it says, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scriptures and the words that Jesus had spoken. And so here you have this disciple whom Jesus loved recording then this switch that after they raised from the dead, then the disciples got it. And so it was this kind of like, well, they didn't get it before, but then after he raised from the dead, then they recalled the Scripture and they reflected on these things. That's kind of an internal description of one who is there, who actually experienced this, and then can describe the shift that happened after Jesus rose from the dead and the resurrection, and how the resurrection impacted their understanding. And so if you go through the book and you work with what's called an elimination procedure that Westcott developed in things, you'll notice that the disciples who are named in the books can't be the disciple whom Jesus loved, because he just designates himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Peter is mentioned in the book. Nathaniel is mentioned in the book. And many of these other folks are mentioned in the books. It can't be Thomas, doubting Thomas. There's a whole thing we'll go through on that. Lazarus, by the way, is mentioned by name in the book. So it's, so you've got those kind of things. And if you look for where are the major disciples then, because we've got all these disciples, Nathaniel, Thomas, Peter himself, listed in the book, then who is this disciple who Jesus loved? If you eliminate all the people that are named in the book, you'll find that there's one lacunae, or one absence missing in the whole book, and that's John. The disciple John is listed nowhere in the book. Peter is mentioned, John is not. Okay? And so you'd think a disciple who was around Peter that much, it would say Peter, James, and John. No, the book never says that. And so many of the disciples are mentioned, including Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, all these other people that we know very well, Nicodemus, etc., but Thomas, but John is never mentioned in the book. So that would, if you eliminate the people who are named in the book, then that leaves us with John as a top candidate for being a writer of the book. So we would suggest that John is the writer of the book of John through this elimination procedure and all these other details that we've gone through. Now, I also want to work the evidence a little bit.